It's an honor to be here. My name is Stepan Martinovsky, and I'm a project leader at Heatherwick Studio. And I was the project leader on Zeitz MOCAA, which this is the project I'm going to talk about. Zeitz MOCAA is a conversion of a historical old grain silo in Cape Town, South Africa, into a contemporary museum of contemporary art from Africa and its diaspora. The building, the silo, was built in 1920s in the harbor area of Cape Town. And it used to be apparently the tallest building in sub-Saharan Africa at that time. And it is heritage protected for that reason. It became it became the symbol of the harbor. It's a testimony to industrial architecture and the engineering skills of those times, such as the way it was built using manually operated slip formwork for the concrete, and also as part of a larger network of silos that were all built together at the same time, connected by railway, kind of harvesting the whole grain production of South Africa, which was then channeled through Cape Town, the silo we worked with. And the building sits in the middle of the harbor, abandoned since 2001, while the remaining area around it has been heavily redeveloped. The area is called V&A Waterfront. It's quite a unique place. It's a mixture of the harbor, which is still functioning. There's fishing boats, there's dry docks, and on the other hand, there's hotels, restaurants, a shopping mall. You see a Ferris wheel. And V&A Waterfront invited us to help them to come up with a new function for this building, which kind of stayed there abandoned for 10 years, like an elephant in the room. And it quickly became apparent that something cultural, something that could open up to people, a gallery or a museum, would be fitting. And along the way came Zeitz MOCAA with their collection of contemporary art from Africa. So we kind of embarked on this journey of converting this building into a museum. Actually, it was composed of two buildings, a tower and the silos connected in the basement by tunnels. And maybe rather than a building, it was a gigantic machine. This concrete shell with its steel intestines to move the grain around, and the cavities then to store the grain. So for the most part, the building actually consisted of these cavities where people never had access to. And so how do you exhibit art in these concrete tubes, 25 meter tall? How do you make a museum which would be unique to the place? And we thought the key was in the existing building because it already had a soul and its history and a spirit. And we were really excited in working with the existing spaces, such as these tall tubes that nobody ever set their foot in before us and our contractors, and the spaces in between them, and the work floors, which kind of remind me of Piranesi drawings, and the machinery and the slightly kinky tunnels underneath. And the brief from the museum was to create white room spaces to be really serious about the art. Rooms which would intentionally not have any architectural detail that would disturb or distract the focus on the art and the stories behind the art. So we took that challenge. We took the found spaces, hollowed them up to create space to wedge in these white boxes, literally wedge them in between the concrete shell. So these two worlds coexist together. They're very much in contrast. The found spaces with their history, the textures of the materials, and these very serious minimal art boxes. And then we felt to relate these two worlds to each other, we needed to create some kind of a central space, a space that would connect the two buildings, a space that would serve as an orientation within the building, a circulation, a heart for the museum. And this space didn't exist as such, like in Tate Modern in London. There was the turbine hall at disposal of the architects. So we had to create the space by demolishing some of the existing cellular structure of the building. So we started thinking about carving the space out. And we've noticed that when you cut these round tubes with a round cut, it creates these intriguing patterns of curves, edges of the walls. And so we were looking for the right shape and borrowed it from the history of the building. We took The building's capacity was 30,000 tons at a time of grain. So imagine how many little pieces of grain that is. We took one of those little pieces of corn, 3D scanned it, enlarged it, and used it as a shape to cut out this central space in the building. And so it cuts through the round bins, it goes down into the tunnels and also into the elevator building. It used to be called the grain silo, meaning the grain as in plural, and it became the grain silo, that one little grain that's gone, but it took tons of concrete with it, and it will be embedded in the building forever in its form of the void. And we have scenic lifts going up and down in these tubes, letting you experience the verticality of the space. We have these steel walkways on the sides, which are as if the new steel intestines of the building, but this time they're moving the people around, not the grain. And then there's a spiral staircase that was kind of dropped in like a gigantic drill bit into one of these tubes, literally spinning on the crane as it went down. And then there's daylight coming in as the round tubes are capped with walkable skylights at the top. And there's actually a open-air sculpture garden on top of that with views of the Table Mountain. And the cuts through the round bins, as I've said, and you see the interstitial spaces too. And then it cuts into the tower where it reveals these rectangular storage spaces. You can see some of the machinery that we've kept in the entry lobbies. Then the cut continues into the tunnels in the basement where you can enter the bottom bowl of the atrium, where the cut reveals the cavities of the foundation walls which supported the whole tubes. And you can touch the concrete and feel it, and it's very polished highly to kind of make it very special. So the atrium is the heart of the building, trying to draw audiences to the inside. And on the outside, we found the building covered with this magnolia render. And when we looked underneath it and jet washed the concrete, we've discovered this original aggregate which apparently came from Table Mountain. And what is special about it is that it's got different sizes of stone and different colors as opposed to any new concrete that we had to use on the project. And so these 25-meter tall solid walls became alive with light and shadow, and you can kind of sense the strata of the slip formwork as they were building it. And we didn't try to hide any of the patchwork, so it really shows the age of the building and brings it some interest. And at the top part, we had to enlarge the existing windows to let some daylight in. So we stripped it down to the kind of the bare structure of it and inserted glazing, and thought that the usual curtain wall glazing wouldn't be appropriate here because of the history of the building and the seriousness of the cultural institution. And so we thought maybe the new life of the building kind of like gently inflates the facades and the structure is holding it back. And we've created these pillows, just like in these Venetian lamps, that it is a hand-blown glass into chicken wire mesh. The mesh holds the glass back, and then it bubbles through to create a lantern. So as well, we've created this gigantic lantern using the pillow facade. And it's almost as a beacon in the harbor, which is drawing people towards the museum. So we don't have a need for any kind of gigantic advertising on it saying this is a museum. It just draws people towards it on its own. So there it is, a 100-year-old building. In its monumentality, we didn't try to put any makeup on it to hide the scars, and we think it's almost got a natural character, the bottom base where the museum's based, and then you can see the new life kind of showing through at the top with the pillow facade. Have I run out? 1 minute. And that's it. That's the entrance to the museum. The old track sheds where the grain used to arrive. And so if you have a chance to visit, please do. There's some fantastic art inside.
Thank you. Again, a very clear presentation. Who wants to kick off? Or I have a question myself I could start with. So there were a couple of steps. You were asked to find a program for the building. and then enters the Arts Museum. And then you casually said something like, and they wanted just to make kind of white cube rooms for the art that wouldn't distract from this. So I'm quite curious there. It's a very particular building, place, etc. And then you still have to deal with this white cube art spaces. What does that mean?
The ambition of the museum was, well, kind of just as the silo building was part of a large network of silos to store grain, the museum's ambition was to connect to the wider worldwide network of galleries and museums, such as Tate. And to be able to exchange exhibitions, they needed a certain amount of kind of standard spaces. You can almost call them generic spaces, international galleries, where you set up an exhibition and you can just ship it off to the Tate or elsewhere. And you can also bring exhibitions from elsewhere. So that's kind of the generic part of it. And then you have the existing building, the found spaces, which have the soul and the uniqueness. And then, of course, the art is spilling out. There's many places, just, for example, the atrium, they have a suspended sculpture from that, I think it won the award in the Biennale a few years ago. And they exhibit in the tunnels. And there's a few places where we were able to keep the bins on the ground floor where you enter and you're in these round tanks which are served for projections. So it's not that these two worlds don't interact. It's more like the containers, the white boxes, are meant to connect to the outside world, and then the art spills out into the building, which is totally unique to the place.
Leslie?
I have perhaps an advantage of having been to the Zeitz several times, and it's an incredibly powerful space. But the architectural moves are very sculptural, probably more so than many buildings I've ever visited. And when you arrive there, you have the impression that there was no other way, it was the right move to make. So from my perspective, it's quite a seamless building. And I want to know, what were the points of difficulty for you? Where did you fight with the building?
Well, I think the idea came about very, very quickly, and we really enjoyed this kind of organic space in the juxtaposition with this modular building, which is totally modular. It's just a grid of squares and circles. And the biggest challenge was actually making it happen, constructing it, figuring out the structural solution, coming out with a kind of a methodology to actually set out the space. Because when we went in, they've just connected these various tubes at the bottom. So it became almost like a labyrinth you could walk through, and the shapes, these curves had to be set out in these separate bins. And we were very eager for the final result to then, match across the various bins to create a smooth, continuous shape. So that was the biggest challenge, kind of working out how to make it. And then the contractors did a very good job working in these confined spaces.
Thank you. Frederick?
Yes, I must say that I entirely disagree with this approach to architecture. I think it mostly appeals to this very dangerous orientation to make architecture a part of the spectacularity of art creation in the last decades, and God knows where that might lead us to. If I have to explain, I haven't been in the building, but of course I've seen it published various times. I would call it something like architectural speleology. I mean, it's like going, digging a hole in the ground and finding the different shapes and the different incidents which organic life can produce within its geological contours. I think architecture is about doing things, it's about building things, it's about producing things that will innovate. It's not a matter of just encountering things by slicing a piece of something out of a larger structure.
What is your question?
I can perfectly well understand the attraction of the building, but I cannot see its relation with architecture.
Yes, please.
Well, interestingly, we spend a lot of time thinking about what museums are, especially of contemporary art. And if you look around the world, it has been almost like a fashion. There's so many cities and towns where in the last 10 years, there's been new museums popping up. And many of them are trying to catch attention by their form on the outside. And then you think maybe, well, those forms don't really relate to the context of the towns. And you could almost, many times, sometimes they do. And so in this case, we thought, let's not do that. Let's work on the inside. So we think that we were quite gentle and subtle to the building. And then by making this move, which is sculptural, it is a very sculptural move, but then you have this very rigid building. And we think that by this one sculptural move, we've actually uncovered the essence of the building that otherwise would never be visible. The tubes, the tunnels, the rectangular bins, when you walk in one view, you can kind of understand how it spatially worked, where the grain was stored. So it's not a game, it's not a joke. It's trying to work with what is the soul of the building, how to show it, how to preserve it.
Spaces that were by nature not accessible. Lee, do you have anything to say?
I think the interior space is a powerful engagement with existing, very functional space. My question is maybe not question. The facade here, the entrance, is this a structure existing or is it a new one?
The bottom, the sheds, that's a reinstatement of the track sheds where the trains used to stop. And then the concrete is the existing building. You can see the kind of the pillars, the structural grid of it.
Yeah.
And then the middle, behind that solid wall, those used to be the storage spaces. And the top levels where we have the windows now, there used to be windows too. Those were the working levels with the various scales and spouts that were to process the...
So what's the thinking behind this? Because normally the sense of arrival is very critical to announce here's a museum. I mean, the inside is quite powerful, but what about the entrance? Any thinking on that?
It's the track shed belongs to the museum, and they're free to curate it. So the idea has always been that they will expand into it. On this photo, you can't really see it, but there's even the train tracks, and we have designed these little moving bogies which serve as pedestals, and you can also open them up so they become like urban furniture, and you can move them around. So the idea was that it will become the porch of the museum where they can show and activate it and do events, and that glazing there in the track shed is the actual entrance.
Okay, thank you very much. We could talk much more than 8 minutes, I think, in the Q&A.